Well, as we bid farewell to 2016, India has said goodbye to the old 500 and 1,000 rupee notes. Good evening and welcome to this special broadcast on CNBC TV 18. Over the next half an hour, we will analyse the impact of the government's demonetisation process. Is the economy near normalcy? Was the pain worth it? These are just some of the questions we hope to answer. Joining me to discuss this massive move and how the world is viewing it are three eminent guests. Natasha, Shereen, economist at Harvard, joins us from California on Skype. Also with me, Sadanand Dhume, columnist with the Wall Street Journal, and Kiran, Stacey, who is the South Asia correspondent for the Financial Times. Appreciate you joining us here on the show. Natasha, let me start by asking you, when we last spoke, which was pretty recent after the 8th of November notification of the Prime Minister and the government, you were very clear. You believed that demonetisation was an exercise that would not really do very much to benefit the Indian economy. At this point, the government continues to defend demonetisation. The government believes that the kind of contraction that people anticipate is exaggerated. They believe that the worst is in fact over, and that as we move towards further remonetization, normalcy will return, and will return in a matter of a few weeks. As we end this 50-day period, what is your own assessment? Because we're still working largely with anecdotal evidence. We're still working largely with estimates, or even guesstimates, if I could call it that.
Yeah, you know, that's a very fair question, and one that I've thought about extensively over the course of the last few weeks, and obviously over the course of the last days when I knew I was coming to talk to you again. I am cautiously slightly more optimistic than I was on November 8th when this demonetization was first announced. I say cautiously because I still think, and I know Professor Summers also believes what we wrote in our blog, which is that all good ideas sort of taken to the extreme become bad ideas. And in the honest assessment of what's happened in India is simply that there was an idea that demonetizing these large denomination bills, relatively large, would help weed out corruption. And I still kind of firmly believe that the extent to which we're actually going to be targeting kind of heavy dollar corruption is quite limited. And also the extent to which we are going to be just directing corruption to a different hold of or store of asset is quite strong. So, you know, gold, Bitcoin is sort of the future almost India in terms of corruption, if it's not already the case for sort of high dollar corrupt transactions. So like, I still don't necessarily understand or think that these were the right ways to attack these goals. And, you know, as a result, which is not surprising to you or your viewers, basically every sort of forecast for India's growth has decreased massively over the course of the last 2 months, down about 2% from what they were at the beginning of November. So that's also sort of cause for concern. The one sort of bright spot, which I want to note, is that, you know, Indian equities are down relative to the emerging market index for the first time in like 4 or 5 years, which is not good news. But on the other hand, large institutional investors think that this is a great time to buy in India, in part because Indian equities are depressed, but also in part because you have a government that, for better or for worse, thinks that it makes sense to take sort of large reform efforts and has the audacity in some sense to do that. So I think, you know, jury is still out, still too early to tell, but I am slightly more optimistic today than I was when I last spoke with you.
Okay, so you're slightly more optimistic than we last spoke, which was close to the November 8th notification. Sadanand Dhume, you know, some are calling it a self-goal on the part of the government. Some call it self-inflicted pain. We don't know whether the demand compression will continue beyond January and into February or March. As I pointed out, at this point, we have very limited, sketchy data on which to base our assumptions. Data from the government is also not very forthcoming. We don't know what the final deposit number is. The exercise of whether there will be any liabilities extinguished on the part of the Reserve Bank coming back to the government by way of a windfall gain seem to be largely academic at this point in time. So how would you sum up this story of 50 days?
No, I would largely agree with you. I think we can say with a great degree of certainty that this is a self-inflicted wound. What we cannot say is how deep is that wound. That's the part that we're going to have to wait and watch. We're going to wait and see what sort of data comes in from December. I did not find any of the numbers that were put out yesterday by the government particularly convincing. The sense is clearly that that GDP growth has taken a hit. The sense is clearly that many businesses have been disrupted, quite apart from the pain that many ordinary citizens have gone through. The question really is, for me, is what do they do going forward now? I think they have to acknowledge that this is a mistake, and then we see what they do to remedy that mistake.
You really believe they're going to acknowledge that this was a mistake? What gives you that impression? Nothing that the government has said so far to even remotely acknowledge that this was anything but not planned.
Fair point. I don't think that there will be any kind of explicit acknowledgement, because that would be political suicide. But I think there could be an implicit acknowledgement by, in fact, going ahead with reform measures that we've been waiting for 2.5 years, such as some significant privatizations, some significant rationalization of taxes that we've been promised for a while, some more movement on labor law reform. If they, in fact, go back to the reform agenda that many people were expecting when this government was elected, then I'd say that you could rescue some kind of silver lining from this demonetization debacle. If, on the other hand, they see demonetization in and of itself as some great reform, I'm afraid that things would look quite dire.
Okay, Kiran, it seems fairly certain now that the government is going to proactively sell the demonetization story with more steps. So what we're seeing as of now is this move towards digital and incentivizing digital transactions and so on and so forth. But perhaps the big tweaks, whether it's in personal income tax or corporate tax, that's what we are likely to see in the budget. But if I were to ask you for a headline today, what would that headline say at the end of 50 days?
It's a good question. It's one that I've been trying to ask myself all day today. What is the cumulative effect of the last 50 days, and how will we look back on this in a year or two's time? The most immediate effect, I think, will be on growth. As we were hearing earlier, most GDP estimates have been knocked down by 2 percentage points, which is not only a huge number, but it's a huge number in an economy that was really steaming ahead. You know, we had estimates of growth above 7%. So this was really an extreme thing to do in an economy that seemed to be growing so well. There's two possible things, other things that we'll look at in the future when we look back at this time. One is, it could prove, it's going to be psychological, I think, a lot of the effects of this. It could be a negative psychological effect. If investors take a look at the last 50 days and they say, the government changed its policy in that period so many times that we no longer trust anything they say, then I think that'll be a real negative. If, however, what this has done is convince enough people in India to say, yes, I think that is a part of the sense that I get. I think people are confused. They were surprised by the move. Investors don't like being surprised. And they were particularly surprised by the fact that the parameters kept changing, which is never a good thing. The one optimistic note that I've been hearing from people I talk to is that maybe this will in the future discourage people from dealing so much in black money, because they never quite know where the government's going to come at them next. If that happens, if there is this mass shift to more digital payment to increase the tax base, to then simplify and rationalize India's entire tax system, we might see that in February at the budget. That will then be a huge positive. But I think demonetization in itself is not necessarily a positive. It's only confused investors, and that's not ever going to be a positive thing.
Natasha, you know, what Kiran says is important, and it's one of the sort of benefits of demonetization that the government is trying to sort of push now. But it requires massive behavioral change, and again, we don't really have evidence at this point in time to see how it's going to play out in the long term. Yes, digital transactions are up. People are buying more railway tickets and so on and so forth online, but that's also not so much out of choice but out of necessity, because you had no other option. If I were to ask you to look at what's happened with such exercises, behavioral economics and how it really works, what do you see in the medium to long term when we talk about making this massive shift from cash to digital?
So it's a very complicated question you ask, and I'm sure many papers will be written about this in the future. I think that this is kind of an unprecedented exercise in sort of this push for a more cashless economy. And this push is not just in India, this push is everywhere. And India almost lags behind relative to developed countries to the extent to which most of the transactions, 70% of them, are done in cash. So it's a very reasonable thing to want more people to make use of these digital payments that are more secure. It keeps black money out of the system. It's sort of more efficient. So the aims are quite noble and understandable. The complexity and kind of where I worry, and again, it's anecdotal, and we're only going to start to see data over the coming months, but also the coming years, to be honest, is that you have a country that is in many places a rural agricultural society where people don't have access to the internet, let alone a smartphone. So it's kind of hard to see how overnight you expect any sort of massive change in the way these people, it's not just behavioral, it's the ability of these people to transact in this economy. And while it makes sense to sort of educate and improve financial literacy and encourage them to be more active participants in this sort of digital world, it's hard to see how overnight sort of the pain that one of my co-panelists mentioned for sort of ordinary citizens is real, and it is being felt day to day by people who work in farming and work in sort of the consumer goods sectors that don't have access to these technologies in a real way. So while the push is noble and kind of maybe what we are seeing is a great period of sort of adjustment before a wonderful, prosperous future for India, and that's certainly what I hope. I'm kind of reminded what Paul Krugman said about demonetization in India, which is that every sort of period of great reform has a period of painful adjustment, but not every period of painful adjustment results in any sort of great progressive reform. So I'm kind of nervous about the extent to which this was unplanned, the extent to which we didn't really think about the implementation difficulties, but also the extent to which we're kind of pushing a society towards being more cashless, which is certainly noble, without really thinking about the capacity of the citizens to really reach that point in the near-term future.
You make an important point there, Natasha, but Sadanand Dhume, let me ask you now, and I think Kiran raised the issue of credibility and how India would now stack up for foreign investors, both from an FII as well as an FDI perspective. I think what gets more interesting now is that the developed market story seems to be picking up steam, specifically the US, for instance, where we're seeing some radical moves towards reforms coming in from the Trump administration, cutting down corporate taxes and so on and so forth. As the world looks towards this big global reset, and given the pain that we are, and medium-term or short-term disruption, at least as of now, that's what we hope that we're seeing in India, how do you see the foreign investment mood change with respect to India?
That's a very good question. Let me quickly first address one thing that Natasha said. I think it's perfectly fine if India moves towards a more digital economy. I take sort of, I don't agree with this idea that there's something noble in it. It's very sort of dangerous in an economy like India to suddenly conflate cash with corruption. There is nothing less noble about a villager somewhere in the interior of Jharkhand who makes all their transactions in cash. And I think it's dangerous, this rhetoric that we're building, that somehow cards or digital payments are conflated with cleanliness and cash is somehow dirty. First point. The second point is that I do think that the government's reputation has taken a huge hit. I think that if you look at the international press, Narendra Modi was really seen as a figure who was supposed to bring far-reaching economic reform to India, and he was also seen as a safe pair of hands, a good economic manager, the guy who ran Gujarat well for more than a decade. All of that, in my view, has taken a severe blow in the international media. It has been more diffuse in India, where there's much more of a debate. But if you look at how this debate has played out in the global press, it's very, very clear that the reputation of both the government of India and the RBI has taken a blow. And so Combine that with what's happening in the United States, where we're expecting the Trump administration to be very aggressively pro-business and put in place some sensible policies, I think that raises pressure on the Indian government to reclaim that reform story. And people are going to be looking at this budget very, very closely.
I just want to get all of you to comment on a conversation that I just had, and the BJP spokesperson basically telling me that the world is going to take note of what India has done and will probably propel or give courage to other governments who've been toying with the idea of demonetization, and will probably push them to take this step forward. Natasha, Shereen, the example was of the $100 bill in the US. You've been writing about that. The BJP believes that Narendra Modi may be some sort of a brand ambassador for the rest of the world to demonetize as well.
Just on one point on the nobility of this goal, I think the only point, I fully agree with sort of the point that was just made. My only point is that in a country where like 2% of the citizens pay income tax, I think pushing people to move towards using their bank accounts more so we have a clearer sense of the money that is in the system is sort of a noble goal, and I presume is the justification for these kind of painful measures that we've seen. On the point of the comparison with whether this will propel other countries forward and the $100 bill, the point about I do think it will serve as an example to other countries, but I'm not sure that it will serve as an example in the way sort of the administration hopes that it will, in that I think it's kind of an example of what not to do, which is sort of radical movements without any real clear thought towards the difficulties of implementation and the pain that's going to be felt by ordinary citizens who transact in cash every single day with bills that are worth approximately $15 and $7.50. So I don't necessarily think that this is the example that the government was hoping for. And on the point of the comparison with the $100 bill, I really see quite clear differences with the proposals that are being considered in the US with the $100 bill, in Europe with the 500 euro note, which is that these are calls to end the future printing of these notes. That's deeply different than declaring legal tender to be illegal tender virtually overnight. And also, if the concern is that we don't want people to transact in high dollar notes because they're known as the bin Ladens because of their use in sort of corrupt and terrorist type of activities, if we don't want people to transact in these high dollar notes, then I understand sort of the rationale for moving them out of circulation and no longer printing them. What I fail to understand is the motivation for kind of pulling them all out of the system and then creating new notes that are exactly the same denomination or even higher denominations with the 2,000 rupee note. So I'm not really sure that the motivations for these actions are kind of the same. And I worry that this is like a one-stop pull to sort of end corruption without any thought, like I said, to implementation, but also to what corruption is going to, where it's going to find itself in the future in India, which could very well just be, as one of your speakers earlier said, just in the 2,000 rupee note, the new one. So I worry.
Okay. So Natasha, Kiran and Sadanand, we need to take a quick break, but do stay on with us. We're right back with you to continue the conversation on what it will take for the Modi administration to reclaim the reform narrative. That and more when we return.